from University. We will talk about Agesilaus way back, Marius varicose veins, and its kidney disease, or the importance of corporeal health for politics according to Plutarch.
Thanks, Delphine, and thank you, also you and the whole group of Coimbra for organizing this wonderful conference. Well, up to now, the organization is blameless, and I guess it will be perfect on the next stage. Also, thanks for that. It's very good to be here with you in Coimbra. Okay, I turn to my paper. Plutarch's political thinking is impregnated with Platonic ideals. Yet Plutarch also knew the problems of everyday political life, and his political thinking contains an important pragmatical component. The politician should never forget his high philosophical ideals, no doubt, but he should also be willing to compromise. This is text number 1 on the handout. And there is yet another element that may add to the politician's challenges, that is his own body. A politician can become sick, and a bedridden politician is a useless politician, unable to perform honorable deeds. Corporeality then entails new constraints and limitations. Now, in a Platonist perspective, the relevance of this issue is not immediately obvious. After all, a Platonist deems the body of little importance and completely subordinate to the soul. Why then should a Platonically inspired politician take scrupulous care of his body, if all his efforts aim at the health of the soul? Well, in this paper, I examine Plutarch's view on this question. More particularly, I have a look at 3 works in which he deals with this issue: De Tuenda Sanitate Praetecta, the political treatises, and the parallel lives. First, De Tuenda. The target audience of De Tuenda is explicitly identified as scholars and politicians. And indeed, at several places in the work, especially near its end, political aspects of the topic are discussed. The core of Plutarch's position is that inactivity does not contribute to our health. 2 arguments support this view. Firstly, idleness destroys the aim of health. This is an important point. Corporeal health is apparently no end in itself, only a means to a higher end. Yet this argument is not without bias. The higher end is here defined as humane deeds. This, of course, reflects a Platonic point of view, in which such deeds are part and parcel of political career. Secondly, this philosophical argument is followed by an argument from concrete reality. Apolitical men were not necessarily healthier than politicians. Xenocrates was not healthier than Phocion, nor Theophrastus than Demetrius. And Epicurus, the classic example of the apolitical philosopher, also had serious health problems. Of course, the value of this argument should not be overemphasized. The sickly condition of a few individuals who live a leisurely life need not disqualify such a life in absolute terms. Yet, it does show that general claims about connection between health and inactivity are problematic indeed. The upshot of all this is that we should especially preserve the natural constitution of our bodies, given that disease and health can be found in every life. The politician then need not worry. A political career is not a priori less healthy than a leisurely life. In light of the above arguments, this is a sensible conclusion. Yet there are several blind spots in Plutarch's general argument. We do not read anything at all about the many risks which a political life entails. All the dangers of politics that are so strongly emphasized by Epicurus and that appear time and again from the stories of the parallel lives hardly contribute to the politician's health, to say the least. Epicurus, he died in bed, like Pericles, by the way. But Caesar was killed with 23 dagger stabs. Crassus lost his head, as did Cicero and Pompey. Moreover, it's reasonable to presume that the politician's endless efforts and sleepless nights undermine his health. So in this respect, the life of leisure indisputably yields interesting advantages. How the politician should deal with these efforts in the most healthy way remains an open question. But in what follows, Plutarch tackles this problem. There he argues that the statesman should use his efforts for the sake of noble purposes. He adds that the soul often makes bad use of the body and ignores its needs. Now, this is a remarkable statement for a Platonist. Of course, Plutarch has in mind the conduct of bad people, but he notes that the point also proves relevant for scholars, like all of us. Yet, one may wonder what has all of this to do with the politician? He does not run such risks, does he? After all, he is not excessively focused on intellectual questions, but is continuously occupied with practical things in the midst of real life. Yet he faces another danger. By uninterruptedly pursuing his ambitious goals, he also risks neglecting his body. For Plutarch, the correct course consists in a well-balanced approach. In minor matters, the politician should give his body some rest, so that it is ready to serve him in big and noble affairs. This principle of tamikra right humain, so neglect small things, is of paramount importance for Plutarch's position. It reflects the balanced mix of philosophical ideals and pragmatism mentioned above, still text one, and it presupposes a careful calculus that aims at the maximization of usefulness. The politician should not be afraid of great efforts, but only if these are really worth the while. In smaller matters, he can relax. The topic of the politician's relaxation requires some further clarification, though, as it entails some additional pitfalls. The sensible politician, so Plutarch argues, should deal with the pleasures of his leisure time in a moderate way. When he is busy with important affairs, he is not interested in corporeal pleasures. Nay, he does not even recollect them, as is illustrated in the funny remark of Epaminondas, and that is text number 2 on the handout. In his free time, on the other hand, the statement gives rest to his body, avoids useless efforts, and especially refrains from unnecessary pleasures. This is strikingly negative phrasing. All in all, I would say Plutarch recommends a well-considered middle course, without explaining how this can be reached. More concrete information about the politician's relaxation has to be sought elsewhere, in the political treatises, and now we turn to them. In several of his political works, Plutarch develops his view of politics as a platonically inspired project of public moral education. The politician is seen as a doctor who cures the moral diseases of his fellow citizens. About the health of the statesman himself, however, Plutarch is far less verbose. The almost complete absence of health issues in the Praecepta Gerendae Rei Publicae illustrates that corporeal health only has minor importance in Plutarch's political thinking. That such health, however, is not completely negligible appears from Anceni Res Publica Gerendae. There, Plutarch reflects on the role which an old statesman can play in public life, and not surprisingly, the theme of corporeal health repeatedly pops up in this treatise. Plutarch tries to convince his old friend Euphanes that he should not abandon politics. One of his arguments is that inactivity is not necessarily more healthy. Again, we here encounter basically the same view as in De Tuenda. But in Anceni, Plutarch takes it more than one step further. He there elaborates on a topic that was not made explicit in De Tuenda, that is, the importance of good health for politics. Well, this importance is at the same time acknowledged and nuanced. On the one hand, Plutarch acknowledges that bodily health is an important condition for political engagement, insisting that the criterion of health is more important than that of age. So a healthy old man then can perfectly remain active in political life. On the other hand, Plutarch also nuances the importance of health. As appears, for instance, from an anecdote about Pompey, that's number 3 on the handout. Many old politicians and generals also performed splendid deeds that far dulled those of their youth. The evidence from history then amply demonstrates that corporeal health is often of minor importance in politics. Yet there is one important addendum that is only brought up in Anseni. Near the end of the work, Plutarch tells the story of the wise Menecrates, and this is handout number 4. This is an interesting anecdote which explores the limits of political engagement. While Plutarch earlier suggested that sickness and old age need not be regarded as decisive factors, we here learn that there exists a minimum level beyond which political engagement can no longer be expected. In spite of his very bad condition, Menecrates, in a truly Spartan vein, wants to obey the efforts, but is then confronted with his own limitations. The relevance of the criterion Tome Trinastai, no longer be able to, is introduced by Spartan boys, and Menecrates accepts its consequences. Old implies can. This is a reasonable position that should not be overlooked by the old politician. Plutarch is most willing to keep the old man involved in public affairs, no doubt, but he avoids unrealistic expectations. There are moments when corporeal health is the decisive criterion. Plutarch also elaborates on the role which the old politician can play. As in De Tuenda, he recommends a balance between moments of relaxation and efforts for a useful and important purpose. Alexander's use of Bucephalus is illustrative of the correct course that's handout number 5. Briefly, Plutarch's position here again rests on the same calculus of maximization of usefulness. Here as well, the principle of tamikra raitimem is combined with the need to engage oneself for the sake of important matters. This mix of pragmatic and high-minded philosophical concerns is perfectly in line with the Platonic foundations of Plutarch's political thinking, and this in Anseni is skillfully applied to the specific situation of the old politician. In De Tuenda, as we have seen, Plutarch is rather vague about the politician's moments of relaxation. Anseni again provides interesting complementary ideas, both regarding the extremes that should be avoided and regarding the middle position. On the one hand, the old politician should avoid an excessive devotion to his public duties. He should not, like the Stoic Zeus, occupy himself with every single detail. Once again, Tamikra Raitimem proves a far better course. On the other hand, Plutarch again puts a ban on base corporeal pleasures. Given that old age yields few opportunities for corporeal pleasures anyway, the old politician should rather prepare for intellectual pleasures. It's there that we find the middle course. The politician enjoys the great pleasures of the active life, while the old politician can also enjoy the recollection of his past accomplishments. And finally, political life itself contains many opportunities for pleasure and relaxation. Such moments of relaxation are perfectly reconcilable with moral standards, with moral Platonic ideals, and with the distinguished reputation of the old politician. All in all, Plutarch's view in the political works then is coherent and clear. He approaches the topic from a Platonic point of view, with much attention for the moral aspects of the issue, and with much sense of balance and moderation. Moreover, he illustrates his view with many historical examples. These can be further completed by a look at the parallel lives. At first sight, the topic of bodily health plays only a minor role in the parallel lives. Most heroes were in a relatively good health. Some of them were sick or had various disabilities, but these are often dismissed as little importance. Furthermore, the heroes were not excessively preoccupied with their health either. Many heroes also adopted a fairly simple way of life, sharing the table of their fellow citizens or soldiers, but their course was usually not followed on prescription, but had everything to do with image building. So lack of concern for the body and bodily needs is strategically used as a means to win the goodwill of the people. Only occasionally, the heroes devote more systematic attention to their body. The case in point is Caesar who suffered from epilepsy. Well, he overcame his sickness by means of his military service. Caesar, of course, was somehow forced to be concerned with his health. Yet he did so in a way that did not interfere with, but rather contribute to his career. Another striking example is Cato the Elder. Cato enjoyed a robust health, which was the result of a careful diet that he had devised himself and with which he had also cured his servants. Cato, then, is a rare example of a politician who clearly showed a more than superficial interest in corporeal health. Yet even in his case, the medal has its reverse. Cato radically rejected Greek medicine, which made his personal diet, DIAITA, the result of dilettantism, and this had disastrous consequences, for he lost both his wife and his son. Cato's counterpart in this respect was Alexander the Great, who was familiar with Greek medicine and even prescribed therapies and regimens, DIAITA again, for his sick friends. Alexander then was certainly better qualified than Cato for devising his own diet. Yet, throughout his career, he showed little concern for his personal health. Although corporeal health, then, is not a primary concern of the hero, it is important in a political context. Several episodes from the lives show that the well-being or rescue of a city or army depends on the health of their leader. Such cases show that a politician should not excessively neglect his corporeal health. After all, he bears a certain responsibility to his people, since their welfare at least partly depends on his good condition. This idea, however, is never made explicit, which shows once again that the topic of bodily health is not the primary theme in the parallel lives. In DIAITA and in Anseni, Plutarch recommends the politician to focus on the most important affairs, on the basis of calculus of maximization of their usefulness. This idea does not come to the fore in the parallel lives. One of the most prominent examples of an influential statesman who pulled the strings but only intervened in great emergencies was, of course, Pericles. Well, we may presume that many other heroes acted like him, but this careful balance is only rarely made explicit in the parallel lives. Plutarch there prefers to focus on the most significant moments, whilst the calculus of maximization of usefulness usually fades into the background. It does receive attention, however, when the hero fails to observe the correct balance. The case in point is Marius, who, in spite of his sickness and old age, went down into the Campus Martius every day in order to exercise himself with a young man. Now, one might argue that such a conduct, in fact, is in line with Plutarch's general position in Anseni. After all, Marius shows that he is still ready for new services to his country, even in his old age. And in fact, Plutarch points out that some indeed were pleased to see Marius' engagement. Yet, perhaps, the better citizens disapproved of his conduct, because they deemed his behavior inappropriate for his age and status. This kind of excessive ambition is obviously not the ideal Plutarch has in mind in Anseli. Only in really big matters should a politician take action, even in spite of his sickness or old age. A telling example of this attitude was given by Ligarius. This is handout number 6. Just a moment, here it comes. Ligarius decided, Hugi, I know, I'm healthy, I'm well, expresses a readiness to comply with the urgent demands of the situation. Such an attitude can often be found in the parallel lives. It was displayed by men like Nicias, Eubenus, Aratus, Alexander, Agesilaus, and Camillus, to name just a few. The references will be in my paper. They all showed the kind of conduct that Plutarch recommends in De Tuenda and Anseli, and they demonstrated once again the relative insignificance of corporeal health for great achievements. In Anseli, Plutarch claimed that important affairs kindle the fire of the old politician. His claim there just remained without argument, but the many examples from history show that it was not unfounded indeed. How did the heroes finally use their moments of rest and relaxation? In De Tuenda and Anseli, we have seen Plutarch acknowledges that such relaxation is necessary, but underlines that it should always meet moral standards. In the parallel lives, Plutarch obviously gives less attention to the heroes' leisure than to their moments of glory, yet here and there some interesting information can be found. Some heroes devote their free time to bodily exercises, hunting, others to reading, yet others combine corporeal and mental activities. Not all heroes were equally exemplary, though. Some aimed at pleasures, or left politics for pleasures in their old age. One of the most notorious examples in this respect is, of course, Lucullus, as in handout number 7. Other heroes fall into the other extreme and made no room for free time at all. So far, the general position with regard to relaxation that appears from this survey bears close similarity to that endorsed in De Tuenda and Anseli. But the parallel lives also contain interesting particular cases that, at least to a certain extent, seem to problematize the general rule. I here confine myself to 2 instances. Demetrius generally appears as a hedonist, prone to sexual pleasures and wine. Yet, he also proved energetic and able to reach impressive military successes, and thus proves to be a perfect example of the kind of behavior that Plutarch strongly rejects in De Tuenda, namely, continuously switching from one extreme to the other. Such utter lack of balance does not contribute to one's health, of course, but it is obviously no less problematic from a moral point of view. Yet, Demetrius was a particularly successful general, and this made his father indulgent towards his moral flaws. Demetrius indeed succeeded in drawing a very strict borderline between his moments of relaxation and his political and military activities. We are almost dealing with 2 different personalities. So in this respect, he far surpassed his counterpart Antony. The question remains then whether Demetrius' military achievements sufficed to varnish over his base pleasures, or whether these pleasures completely overshadow the importance of his military successes. Or does the truth lie somewhere in between? This remains an open question, and it's up to the reader to decide. Similar case is Scipio. He, of course, is a very distinguished figure, and accordingly his behavior, though in fact quite similar to that of Demetrius, is presented in a much more positive way. and in contradistinction to the over-rigid course of Cato. Whereas Cato's austere way of life indeed rather recalls the extreme regimen that is rejected in De Duenna, Scipio preferred a far more luxurious lifestyle. Cato then denounced Scipio before the Senate, but Scipio replied that he had perfectly prepared the war. He describes his extravagant way of life in strikingly positive terms, philanthropia, and underlines that it does not interfere at all with the important political and military affairs. We thus find the same tension between impressive military accomplishments and periods of extravagant relaxation as in Demetrius' case, although Scipio's course seems to receive a much more positive appreciation. This obviously raises interesting questions. Figures like Demetrius and Scipio are quite exceptional, no doubt. But their career is obviously a challenge to a view like that of Plutarch himself, a view which aims at moderation and self-restraint. To conclude, very briefly, all things considered, I think it would be exaggerated to claim that corporeal health is a major theme in Plutarch's political thinking. Plutarch was every inch a Platonist, and was much more interested in the soul than in the body. For him, health primarily meant the health of the soul, moral health. Nevertheless, corporeal health is discussed here and there. Plutarch generally aims at a balance between extremes. On the one hand, he rejects both an extremely rigid regimen and excessive attention to the body and its pleasures. On the other hand, he does not recommend to ignore the demands of the body altogether. The politician's task then is to find a delicate equilibrium, taking care of his body, while always regarding it as a mere means in the service of an honorable goal. Thank you very much.
Presentation, and we continue with 11 people. So I will give the floor now to Lorenz and the field, who will speak about the king had no tables, Ptolemy's frugality and conviviality in Plutarch's Regum, imperatorum, apophthegmata 181. Lorenz, the floor is yours. As soon as I announce you.
So thank you very much, Delphine, also for the organization, of course, and the same goes, of course, for Herman and Soraya and Daniela. It's great to be here in Coimbra and to see all of you again, of course, in order to discuss the topic of DIAITA in Plutarch. And since DIAITA in Plutarch includes both the idea of DIAITA in its core meaning as a way of living and the notion of conviviality, I thought it would be interesting to discuss a passage combining both concepts. And one such passage can be found in Plutarch's Regum imperatorum apophthegmata. And I will discuss the one and only apophthegm told about Ptolemy, son of Lagos. And the apophthegm in question reads as follows: Ptolemy, son of Lagos, used as a rule to dine and sleep at his friends' houses, and if ever he gave a dinner, he would send for their dishes and linen and tables, and use them for the occasion. He himself owned no more than were required for everyday life, and he used to say that it was more kingly to enrich than to be rich. Well, the research question I will try to answer concerns, perhaps it seems quite obvious, but the precise meaning of this apophthegm, but in context, in its broader contextual context. So, in other words, how is the story to be interpreted as a part of Regum et imperatorum apophthegmata, and what does this mean for Plutarch's ideas about the perfect case, DIAITA? And when discussing this one specific apophthegm, I will therefore not regard the story as a separate entity to be read on its own, but as part of a larger role, so as part of a literary work of art in the same way as, say, a chapter of the life of Alexander or the Coimbra. Era is to be interpreted in the context of the entire text, and this might seem quite obvious, but in studying Regum et imperatorum apophthegmata, scholars often only pay attention to the apophthegm on its own in order to say something about its appearance in another work. So this is, of course, a very valuable focus, but not the focus of me today. And in this respect, the secondary goal of this paper is to shed light on Regum et imperatorum apophthegmata as well, so more specifically on the way in which the work is structured and on the way it attempts to guide its readers towards specific conclusions. So, first, something about Regum et imperatorum apophthegmata. The work, as you all probably already know, is a collection of almost 500 apophthegms on famous rulers and generals of the past. And the text is introduced by a dedicatory letter addressing the Roman Emperor Trajan. And this letter, and as a consequence, the entire work was considered spurious for a long time, especially during the 19th and 20th century. But Flasselier, Vuurman, and Beck changed the Communi's opinion with convincing arguments, and the closed stylometric analysis of the wording and expressions in the letter confirms their conclusions indeed. So the work should be read as an authentic work of Plutarch. Third, the goal of Regum et imperatorum apophthegmata is to instruct the Roman emperor. And as Serena Citro has pointed out, the text should recommend specific virtues and values that are indispensable for the good ruler. And this is, as Mark Beck and Serena Citro again convincingly argue, already announced by the opening lines of the dedicatory letter. So Artaxerxes, the king of the Persians, O Trajan, emperor most high and monarch supreme, used to think that, as compared with giving large gifts, it was no less the mark of a king and a lover of his fellow men to accept small gifts graciously and with ready goodwill. And you probably already noticed the close similarities with the apophthegm of Ptolemy quoted at the outset of this presentation, and that's also why I quote these lines here already. But I will circle back to this in a few minutes, but for now let's just focus on the fact that Plutarch wants Trajan to learn from Regum et imperatorum apophthegmata. So after this passage, Plutarch tells an apophthegm describing Artaxerxes' disposition well, and he also asks the emperor to model his behavior after the Persian king's actions. And this obviously alludes to the goal of the text itself. Trajan should draw moral lessons from the apophthegms he will read in the collection. This also appears from how the Cyrenian explicitly describes the function of the work later in the dedicatory letter. So Trajan is a busy man, of course, and does not have sufficient time to read the parallel lives. The author therefore made a collection of sayings, deleting all actions, as these sayings will provide quick and clear insights into characters of the past. I will not read this passage, but the obvious implication of this idea of assessing great men of the past, or at least examining them, so rulers and generals, of course, the point of assessing them is, of course, that Trajan, who is himself a ruler and general, can also learn from their characters, from their behavior, or at least their sayings, I have to say, and adapt his own rule. And even though this second step of moral improvement is not made explicit, it still is alluded to in the letter, obviously because this is also the goal of the parallel lives, but for example also by a mirror metaphor earlier in the letter, but I will not focus on that right now because that would take us too far. So finally, something about the material included in Regum et imperatorum apophthegmata. So Plutarch is more or less consistent with how he introduces the collection at the end of the letter, so which I just quoted. So what follows is a collection of almost 500 apophthegms, of which many, but definitely not all of them, concern the subject of a life and occur in that life. And most of these apophthegms, but again not all of them, contain a saying or a reaction of the man of the past. However, many of these apophthegms also contain more than this saying alone. So some provide a short or lengthy description of the background of the saying or the event provoking the saying, usually in order to make the reaction comprehensible, of course. So often this is a necessity, but sometimes Plutarch also adds the aftermath of the event described. And especially such cases are surprising because he writes in his letter that the outcome of events cannot provide a clear insight in the true character of a historical figure. And this is why he collected sayings alone. This is, by the way, also clearly illustrated by means of an apophthegm on Seramnes, an unknown Persian. So if Plutarch sometimes adds the aftermath of a saying in his collection, he is obviously not entirely consistent with the point you want to make here in this apophthegm or in the letter. So apparently the outcome of events and the effectiveness of actions are in some cases still important to assess historical figures, and that's important for me today. So we will now take a look at the apophthegm on Ptolemy itself. This apophthegm also not only contains a saying, but generally speaking, it consists of two parts. So the first part that describes Pompey's actions, and the second one which contains the saying itself. And at first sight, Ptolemy's frugality is praised, but at closer look, more is going on. So if we just take a look at the first part, this part describes a peculiarity in Ptolemy's behavior, and this is also emphasized by means of a chiastic structure, which contrasts the king's usual practice with his only rarely seen behavior, and this leads to a surprising punchline. So Ptolemy usually went to his friends for dinner and spent the night at their place, but only rarely he organized an eating and slumber party himself. So rarely that even if he organized a convivium, he was forced to borrow his friends' equipment. So in the chiastic structure, all emphasis is on tois ekenon ikreto, which is further stressed by the ominous phrase, I didn't quote it here, but this lists all the objects which Ptolemy had to borrow. And then the second part, this is the saying itself, and this seems to contain an explanation of Ptolemy's peculiar behavior. So Ptolemy simply did not possess more than the bare essentials because he considered it more kingly to enrich than to be rich. So in line with the dedicatory letter to Trajan, one expects this second part, so the saying, to be the main part of the apophthegm. In fact, one can only hardly see the relevance of the first part, so the actions, if the collection is about sayings and sayings alone. So without the first part, the apophthegm would have been complete as well. And additionally, a closer look at this first part also reveals a certain inconsistency between Ptolemy's behavior and his saying. So kings should enrich others, kings should use their wealth for others. That's what Ptolemy claims, but he himself is doing rather the opposite actually, because when giving a party, he is using his friends' wealth. And this is surprising actually, because Ptolemy was well known as a gentle king, especially because of the many gifts he often bestowed upon his friends. And this appears, for example, from Diodorus Siculus, who tells a story in order to illustrate especially this aspect of the king's character in his Bibliotheca Historica 19, chapter 86. So Plutarch could obviously have included a similar story if he wanted, but he decided to focus on Ptolemy's frugality, and one could in fact even speak of his poverty, because of which one can only conclude that the king was that poor that he was unable to enrich others. So at least that's how he tells the story here. And as a consequence, the image of Ptolemy in Plutarch here is not very flattering at closer reading, and definitely not when compared to this univocally positive picture of Diodorus' passage. And in this respect, it is important to recall that Regum and imperatorum apophthegmata were written for Trajan, as I said, who is invited to learn from the exemplar in order to improve his rule. And in the case of Ptolemy's apophthegm, Ptolemy even seems to have adapted to the original saying to this end, as is suggested by Alien's Varia Historia 13, chapter 13, which includes the same saying. So they say that Ptolemy, like his son, rejoiced exceedingly at greatly enriching his friends, and he used to say that it was better to enrich than to be rich. So it's obviously the same saying as the one of Regum and imperatorum apophthegmata, as you can see. But in Island one reads amenon, which is a much more general category than basilicatorum. And amenon was probably part because of the original saying, because basilicatorum seems to be a secondary adaptation in order to connect various apophthegms with each other throughout the entire Regum and imperatorum apophthegmata, and that will be the focus of the next part of my presentation. So Throughout the first part of the collection, which only concerns monarchs, the first third of Regum, imperatorum, apophthegmata only discusses barbarian kings, Sicilian despots, and the Macedonian monarchs, and also the DIAITA. So in this part, there are 4 apophthegms that connect the theme of giving and taking with the form of basilikos, as was also announced by the dedicatory letter. So the apophthegm on Artaxerxes Mnemon, which I quoted. So in fact, we have 5 of these apophthegms, and I show them here on this slide. So I think it's quite clear that these apophthegms are modeled after each other, because only in Alexander 31, as can be seen from other accounts of the story, and in Antigonus 15, as can be seen from this account in the Wikiosopitori, only in these 2 cases the form of basilikos was doubtlessly part of the original apophthegm, and that being the apophthegm as it was included in Plutarch's notes. In the case of the dedicatory letter, however, basilikon seems to be a secondary adaptation, and the same probably goes for Ptolemy, the first apophthegm, as I just have shown, and in Artaxerxes Longimanus, his first apophthegm. It is even possible that the entire saying is a fabrication of Plutarch in order to connect the Persian king with his grandson, so the subject of the first apophthegm of the dedicatory letter, because this apophthegm actually does not occur in the life of Artaxerxes, where the first Artaxerxes nickname is explained in the opening lines of this biography. So Plutarch just created a network of similarities in terms of wording in order to connect a series of apophthegms concerning how a king should deal with riches. And his goal is obviously to invite the reader to take these stories together and to compare them with each other. And we will now take a look at the result of such participatory readership. So in the opening apophthegm of the dedicatory letter, Artaxerxes Mnemon is of the opinion that it is not less kingly to give great presents than to accept small things. And in what follows, he therefore accepts water from a river given to him by a humble man. And this part I didn't quote on the slide to save some space. So in the apophthegm on Artaxerxes I, the elder Artaxerxes claims that it is more kingly to give than to take. And this is connected with his nickname, Macrochier, so Longimanus, although Artaxerxes in fact received this name because his left hand was larger than his right hand. Then we have Alexander 31. This apophthegm describes Porus' request for Alexander to treat him in a kingly way after his defeat at the Battle of the Hydaspes. So Alexander is impressed by this response, and not only it allows the Indian king to keep his kingdom, but he even grants him a larger domain. Ptolemy his first apophthegm I discussed, of course, and then Antigonus 15 is a witty story about the cynic who asks the king for 1 drachma. The king refuses, for this is not a kingly gift. So the cynic asks for a talent, but the king refuses again. A cynic should not accept such a gift, he thinks. So if all these apophthegms are taken together, one reaches a more or less coherent view of how a king should deal with riches, and therefore about the perfect king's DIAITA to a certain extent. So first, kings should not care about wealth and about their own possessions, seems to be the implication. So a frugal lifestyle, a frugal DIAITA is recommended because Artaxerxes is not insulted by the smallest gifts. Ptolemy does not possess more than is necessary. Alexander the Great is the most frugal man as well, and this appears especially from other apophthegms in the collection. But on the other hand, the king should enrich others with great gifts. So Alexander says it is also kingly to give great gifts. And his grandfather, so Artaxerxes Longimanus, claims that giving is more important than taking for kings, and Ptolemy actually makes exactly the same point. And Alexander even gives back a larger kingdom than Porus possessed before. And you also have Antigonus, who is not willing to give a present that is too small for a king to give. Yeah, the king should not enrich everyone, as also appears from the witty apophthegm on the Antigonus. And the more serious story of Alexander. So a cynic should not be given a talent. A wise king, such as Porus, especially a wise king, deserves to rule, of course, and this is why he deserves a large kingdom. So a king should carefully reflect on who should accept a present and how great this present should be. So by means of riches, a ruler can also strengthen his or her position by giving great gifts. A king can make friends and keep all subjects happy. And here we reach the theme of conviviality again. So precisely by his act of mildness and generosity, Alexander also ensures that Porus will be loyal to him. And other apophthegms in the monarchical part of Regum, imperatorum, apophthegmata, and especially in the section on Alexander the Great, also stress the importance of establishing friendships and social connections by means of wealth and mildness. So what I want to say is that there is a certain discrepancy between the first point, which is more philosophical in nature and fits the notion of autarkia, actually, and the second one, which is rather pragmatic. And precisely this discrepancy is problematized by the apophthegm Ptolemy. So on the one hand, the king should not care about money and wealth, but on the other hand, the sole ruler needs riches, a lot of riches actually, in order to establish a stable reign and to satisfy his subjects. So Ptolemy as presented by Plutarch, apparently knew what he had to do. So he knew that he had to lead a frugal lifestyle himself. He also knew that he had to enrich others. That's precisely because he took the need for frugality too literally. He was unable to fulfill his second task. And in light of this, the focus on Ptolemy's strengths in the apophthegm is of paramount importance. So a king should maintain friendships by means of wealth, but Ptolemy even needed his friends when organizing the convivium. So from a philosophical point of view, then, the king's disposition is to be praised, for he was not personally affected by an empty love of riches by Philopatia. From a political and pragmatic point of view, however, one might question his poverty because of his lack of riches. Ptolemy could have been unable to maintain contact with, in an appropriate manner, with people whose support he actually might have needed. And this brings me to a brief conclusion. So first about Regum, imperatorum, apophthegmata in general. Plutarch not only included similar stories in the collection, but also created close connections, mostly in terms of wording, between them in order to ensure that the readers would notice these similarities and would read the stories in question together. Regum, imperatorum, apophthegmata then is not an incoherent pick and mix of isolated units selected at random by the author, but requires an active and participatory readership that can bring the audience, perhaps more specifically Trajan and other monarchs, to conclusions about good and bad rulership. And the apophthegm Ptolemy is a clear example because only when being read in combination with other apophthegms similar in content and wording, general guidelines for the good ruler's relationship with riches can be derived. The reader should conclude that kings have to be wealthy, otherwise their rulings might fail, but this does not mean that kings should be rich because of a wealthy life itself. Riches are nothing more than a means for a fruitful rule, a means to keep one's subjects satisfied. And this is, in the end, actually what Ptolemy's saying means. It is more kingly to enrich than to be rich, yet only the wealthy man is capable of enriching others, of course. Ptolemy then did not put his own words into practice, and precisely because of this reason, the readers are invited to question his qualities as a ruler. And the critical reading thus results into a complex discussion of the balance between the king's internal disposition, Ptolemy's frugal DIAITA, and the effectiveness and advantages of concessions to practical reality, maintaining friendships and social connections by means of wealth and convivial sumptuous dinners. Thank you very much.
For having guided us so swiftly, so interestingly through the apophthegmata, and it is now time to turn to JOAQUIM PINHEIRO, who comes from the University of Madeira, and who will speak us about the concept of DIAITA in Plutarch's Roman lives. Oh, yes, please use this here for me.
Before, I wanted to thank the organizers and the Center for Classical and Linguistic Studies for all the support, and of course it's a great pleasure to be here with the Plutarch family. I will read my paper. It's a brief version of my paper in English. And you can see the now, see. In biographical writing and in the internal structure of each biography, DIAITA does not occupy an autonomous space. No goals there seem to be a specific plan by Plutarch to make the theme of DIAITA central to the characterization of his heroes. In fact, the aim of Plutarch's biographical narrative is not to describe characterizing elements and that are related to DIAITA. Moreover, DIAITA is a theme addressed in antiquity and in different contexts, whether in texts clearly related to food or in medical or philosophical treatises, among others. It is therefore a common theme which concerns the body and the soul, as it contributes to the well-being and balance of the human being. As Galen expressed in some treatises, the treatise De Fortune Formatione is one of the examples, the issues of body and soul are dealt with by doctors and philosophers, sometimes with different opinions. Even since the Hippocratic tradition, a soul-body interdependence is established in which the DIAITA is attributed the cause of some ills of the soul, especially in the Moralia, namely Quaestiones Naturales, de Ofrenda Sanitate, de Solerte Animalium, de Exocarnum, or Quaestiones Convivales. As some of the presentations in this meeting will demonstrate, Plutarch addresses issues related to health and therefore the theme of food or way of life is naturally integrated into his reflections, often of a moral, didactic, religious and philosophical nature, in which the classical sources by Pythagorean, Platonic or Aristotelian influences can be noted. In fact, the boundaries between medicine and philosophy are very tenuous and complex to define. This can be verified by the different contexts in which the concept of DIAITA is used in classical antiquity. Also, for this reason, the interpretation of the concept of DIAITA becomes a challenge for the reader, not only for trying to identify the root of Plutarch's thought, but also for understanding the role the concept of DIAITA plays in the biographies. So, the main purpose of this paper is to explore the different senses of the DIAITA concept in Plutarch's Roman lives. It should be noted that Plutarch shares the idea that some individuals follow nature more, while others are more prone to custom or habits. That is, that some follow the rational part, while others the irrational part, without advocating that one should eliminate the most irrational part, in effect going against the Stoic precepts that sought to banish all elements of the irrational part, since this constitutes a mistake. Instead, Plutarch advocates that the irrational part deserves to be cultivated and enhanced for what is useful and good, for example, in treatises De Virtute Morale. Indeed, the DIAITA, like anger, origin, defines the limits of human irrationality, as Plutarch repeatedly lays out in moral treatises and biographies. The choice of Plutarch's lives does not mean that the concept of DIAITA cannot be studied in Greek lives, of course. In general, we can say that there is no symmetry in the occurrence when we compare the biographical pairs. For example, in the biography of Aristides, it never occurs, but that of Cato Major is one of those that allows us a more in-depth analysis of this subject. Considering the most relevant meanings of DIAITA, we organize the text into 4 thematic groups. Part A, DIAITA with the sense of residence, home, accommodation, the sense of space. One of the senses that the word DIAITA may have had was the generic reference to a place of residence or a place. In most cases, this does not contribute directly to the characterization of the heroes, unless one tries to stress, for example, that the residence, because of its opulence or simplicity, reflects a certain way of life. We have therefore selected a few texts, and out A1. In this text, Plutarch tells us that Hannibal, because he was suspicious of the Roman, was busy building 7 underground passages in his oikia from the DIAITA itself, which went in different directions. In Lucullus' biography, and out A2, using the words oikasis and DIAITA, he tells us that Ptolemy, as a sign of his education and benevolence, gave Lucullus lodging and food in the royal palace. And out A3. Also, in the biography of Lucullus, although Plutarch emphasizes military and political achievements, he does not fail to criticize and a certain tendency towards opponents and or excessive spending. One of the examples besides Lucullus' famous gardens, the famous Horti Luculani, is the array of buildings around Naples. Great tunnels in the hills, lakes with canals surrounding the palaces, lakes with seawater to breed fish, and villas in the sea. Because of this megalomania, the Stoic Tuberon, according to Plutarch, called Lucullus Cherches with toga, the traditional dress in Rome. The origin of this epithet, however, was attributed to Pompey by Plinius, a correction made by several commentators. The allusion to Cherches is justified by the fact that the project a great canal to Mount Athos, or because of the bridge over Hellespontus, which Herodotus mentions in his Histories Book 7. Then Plutarch mentions that Lucullus also had emporioi DIAITA, country or rustic dwellings, in Tusculum, again using the term DIAITA in the sense of dwelling or residence. Part B, DIAITA, way of living, mode of life, lifestyle. The second group, which integrates the sense of life, of style or way of life, linked to customs and habits, is the one with the greatest number of examples. Sometimes the relation of DIAITA to physical constitution, for example, in the Roman's life, or reveals a metabole diaitis, as the case of Numa, who renounces city life to live in the countryside, to spend time in the forest of the gods, in the sacred meadows, and in solitary places. If Numa's choice of a more solitary life is a voluntary act, this is not so in the case of the Vestal Indian or Rhea or Sylvia, who became pregnant and who was arrested and condemned to a life of isolation. The Greek text is diaitan eke and epimeton. And out B1. The desire to have a life outside the city, which denotes a certain idea of evasion, is also found in the biography of Cato Maior, and in an even clearer way in that of Marius, who preferred the sobriety of art country life to the elegance and refinement of the city, probably because of his humble origins. According to Plutarch, Pompey himself would be object of the exile for the fact that they lived together with a woman in the country. Remaining on the sense of DIAITA as way of life, though it may be subject to external reasons such as space or even climate, it still mostly depends on the active attitude of the protagonists. Volumnia, for example, in a moment of considerable tension, states that he will not wait for the war to decide the duty, but will do everything in his power to determine living conditions. This idea coincides with another thought that Plutarch expounds with greater clarity in the biography of Pompey, and out B2. In summary, through paideia, man can shape his nature and gain habits and customs that will help him to have a proper way of life. In the case of Pompey, Plutarch recounts that the Romans loved him because of the sophrosune that evidenced in this life, even though they ate this father. In fact, training for a certain DIAITA is one of the ideas that Plutarch defends recurrently, as is in the case in the biography of Cato Maior, when he says that from the beginning, the Roman was accustomed to individual work, to a life, to a mode of life, and to military life, which contributed to a harmonious appearance of the body and to having in equal measure strength and health. Following the principle of Roman disciplina, Plutarch remarks in his biography of Cato Maior that the Romans, the regimes of life, should have rules and be subject to inquiry, since it would not be advisable to allow for freedom and will without limits. In this way, he seems to want to avoid that pleasure or an act of emotional lack of controlled conditioning the definition of DIAITA for the individual. In spite of behind a well-known episode on brings to mind the role that Cato had in the education of his son, who would have had a fragile physical composition, according to Plutarch, a characteristic that would have helped him to contain his way of life. The reference to DIAITA sometimes offers very curious cultural notes. In Coriolanus' biography, it is recorded that the domestic slaves were treated with benevolence, epietia, and that they even shared his way of life. In other cases, DIAITA appears as a desire for an opportune moment to define a more relaxed lifestyle after so many combats and political disputes, as is in the case of Metellus, prized for his sobriety. The lifestyle may also condition the reputation that one generates among citizens. This seems to have been the case of Caesar, who, according to Plutarch, quote, because of the splendor of the dinners and the table and his whole way of life and of God, so his fame and power increased in the Politeia. Also, the Cato Maior, the DIAITA, caused admiration among Valerius Flaccus because he learned from his servants that Cato, among other activities, went to the forum very early and made himself available to those most in need. He worked and ate with his servants. He tried to be kind and moderate in his actions. In the role of Cato biography, what stands out above all the portrait of an austere man with regular habits and who tried to apply the ancient Roman values, mos maior. Part C. Although it has almost no occurrence in Plutarch Roman lives, a brief note must be made on the sense of judgment or decision that the word DIAITA may have in a context in which, for example, intervention in public administration is dealt with. This is what happens in the biographies of Camillus, Coriolanus, Aemilius Paulus, Cato Maior, Marius, and Cato of Utica. But these are accessory references and, in my opinion, are in no way structuring in the definition of ethos. Part D, DIAITA. Finally, the use of DIAITA to translate diet or something related to the act of eating. In general, Plutarch, as seen earlier, seeks to defend the idea of moderation at the table to achieve the necessary well-being. Mostly the references to food are brief, without details on foodstuffs, and are integrated into the narrative to reinforce some attribute of the protagonists. Here are two examples. Handout D1. Distrustful of the Greek doctors to practice in Rome and having heard that Hippocrates would never treat the barbarian enemies of the Greeks, Cato Maior asked his son to stay away from these doctors, and he himself wrote a treatise to care for and cure the sick in the oikos. He thus prescribed a light diet for those who were healed based on vegetables, small pieces of duck, pigeon, and hare meat. Thus, in Plutarch's narrative, DIAITA is clearly associated with health and the act of treating to avoid the poor illnesses. It should be noted that this attitude of Cato reveals his defense of Roman identity, not accepting the Hellenization of Roman culture. And I'll dig too. In Caesar's biography, the link between diet and health is even clear. Plutarch says that Caesar was moderating his diet, suffering from headaches and epileptic seizures. To control these problems, he used as treatment military activity, endless walks, a frugal diet, a life in the open air, hard work to keep the body humanized. Of course, today no one would prescribe this. Further on, it is said that Caesar's army had been attacked by an infectious disease originating from an inadequate diet. In Plutarch's Roman biographies, we find only a single occurrence in which the word dieta means diet in the sense of a dietary regime, the main aim of which is slimming. This does not apply to any of the heroes, but to Cleopatra, who decided to stick to a strict diet because of her rival Octavia. So final remarks. After our analysis, it is not possible to argue that the DIAITA plays a startling role in the Plutarch's Roman biographies. In fact, except for the biography of Cato Major, where the elements on DIAITA are more relevant, in none of the other biographies it is easy noted that Plutarch draws part of the portrait from DIAITA. Another aspect that is conducive to this conclusion is the fact that DIAITA almost never appears in the Sulpices, a moment that Plutarch takes advantage of to establish a parallel based on the main characterizing elements. Furthermore, concerning the texts that have been analyzed, it can be concluded that, first, although in an accessory way, DIAITA reinforced the value of Sophrosune, Metriotes, or Autarkeia. Second, in addition to its individual dimension, due to the effort that each person must make to achieve the balance between soul and body, the DIAITA also has a public dimension if it is considered that, on the one hand, Plutarch's heroes are models, and on the other, there is a social dynamic in the biographies that aims more at the collective than the individual. For example, in Sertorius' biography, Plutarch emphasized the consequences of external constraints on Fusis and DIAITA. This serves to excuse, in some way, the course of the Roman hero and eventually the mistakes he may have made. In fact, Sertorius is presented as a moderate man who replaced the various pleasures with the exercise of the body, and that in idle moment he drank in excess. Third, by knowing and behind interest in the medical tradition, and also through his strong connection to philosophical thought, Plutarch established a close relation between DIAITA and therapy. Form DIAITA as a regime of style of life is something that the human being defines conditioned by nature, education, the place where he grows and lives, his public activity and experience, climate, or even the duty. More than the medical prescription, everyone should know themselves in order to judge and decide at each moment the most convenient DIAITA and if metabole diaetes is necessary. Thank you.
Very much looking for this categorization of users of DIAITA, Roman life, which is extremely interesting, very useful. I would ask the other speakers to come up and join us. Only voice today, which is regrettable in fact that we have the presence of Soraya, who it's our peaceful course, so it's to vote for us. So we have a few minutes for discussion, so I would invite you to pose your questions in whichever language you prefer, and if there is any doubt, so I can translate it into Greek, no problem at all. So please, it's much better to listen to your questions and then we'll answer. Serena,
Lauren, thank you for your paper. And, your research touches some topics similar to mine. And I have just a little remark for you. Do you analyze other apophthegmata about kings of the eastern area? Is there, in their dieta, is there more attention to truffes or delicious food or not?
more questions? Well, I can please.
Thank you all. As Delphine said, only boys, but we are here, so no problem. I'd like to put some questions to me. And one is, I know you have an explanation or an interpretation, but I'd like to listen to you. Why Plato is the exception. In all the Romans, the one DIAITA in this biography has more place is Cato. I'd like to have more comments of you. Of course, we have very few time to expose our thoughts. This is the case. And another, I don't know if it is a question or an observation. You mentioned also in your conclusions that the general position, and I found it in other passages of Plutarch, in which concerns the physicians, is that the member of the aristocracy, ideally, he should not have to recur to physicians, avoid physicians. There are some positions of Plutarch against physicians in general. Why is that? I'd like also to have your opinion on both subjects.
More questions? Okay, please.
I have a question for Geert. In light of what, I mean, these very interesting materials you presented to us, why did you feel the need to stress that Plutarch is every inch a Platonist, and what does that mean?
So we have at least one question for each of the participants. So I will give the floor to perhaps the first, or we can, if you would like to think a little bit more. So Lawrence, we'll start by you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question today. I've also analyzed those sections, and there is some emphasis on the idea of truth, I believe, but it doesn't really stand out in the characters of the kings themselves, as I see. Because what I noticed was that in the first section on Pyrrhus, we see that that the Persian people ask for another country, so a soft country, a larger country where they do not have to, where walking is more easy and things like that. So that's what they ask Pyrrhus. And Pyrrhus says, no, Persians have to be like the land where they live, so which means harsh and rough. So we see a certain contrast between the king there and the people, and I think that this idea is further developed in the remainder of the Persian section. So, for example, Pyrrhus the Younger, who asks, who wants to take his throne from his brother because he is too soft and so on. So this idea of prepare also occurs there, I believe. So it's an idea of That's at least something which I know. So a difference between how the kids want their people to be and how the Persian people themselves are. Of course, I'm also very interested in what you think about this and how you see this. That's how I read the first part there on the Persians in the apophthegmata.
Okay, yes. Now, reasons for you to continue to talk during lines, but before that, let's listen to JOAQUIM and regarding Alan's question.
Okay, thank you very much for the questions. I think two questions. First, about Cato, why the more elements in this biography. I think for this exercise of interpretation and analyze, I think we need to, of course, in Plutarch to see the two wives. In fact, the wife of Agesilaus, we cannot find any word related directly with the DIAITA. But in Cato Minor, we have very interesting elements for studying this idea, this concept of DIAITA. Of course, Cato is a very important person of political life in Rome. Is a model of frugality. Is a model of someone that knows very well this concept, and of course, included he writes a treatise for his son on DIAITA, and of course in other elements, but we only have fragments of this treatise, and this is one of the cases in the synthesis we have elements on DIAITA. This and the pair of Lucullus, I think. In the other pairs, we cannot find this concept in the synthesis. So, in my opinion, Plutarch wants to underline this life to the readers. About the other questions, of the concept that we have today about physicians and the doctors is very different than the notion in the antiquity. I don't find in the text that I know the specialist in DIAITA, in the antiquity. Of course, some doctors tells us something about this concept, for example, Galen and others. But the perspective is philosophical perspective, not strictly a perspective of a physician or a doctor. I don't know if I respond to your question.
No, you did. In fact, what I noticed is that when the approach of physicians concerning intellectual person is that we should avoid, in which concerns DIAITA, because an aristocrat should know himself, his nature, his uses, know how he reacts to food, weather, all changes we have in life. And the physicians, in general, they came from lower class, and what they act as sovereigns, lords of a free man, and many times they are not free men. So this is also the question of political, social, class background, and in which concerns DIAITA, not other problems more to do with chirurgical things or pharmacology, no. But in DIAITA, okay. But it was only to make us think more. Anyway.
Very much. And now going back to Kurt and to find a slippery question.
Yeah, well, thanks, Ryan. That's a very fundamental and interesting question. Why did I want to emphasize it? Well, in a way, because that whole topic of corporeal health, which I'm discussing, and perhaps even broader, the whole topic of this conference, in a way, is a challenging topic for a Platonist. If you recall, Plotinus, who was ashamed of having a body, or if you recall Porphyry, somewhere in his own abstinence, if I'm right, I'm not recalling that very well, but there's also a passage where he actually warns against paying too much attention to DIAITA and such things, regimens, just because you then take the body far too seriously. And after all, you are Platonists, and well, we should neglect the body. It's all about the soul. So, as a Platonist, one would expect that this topic, of course, is of minor importance. When you then go to Plutarch, the Platonist, every ancient Platonist, well, you see that there is still quite some attention to the body. He takes that quite seriously, between limits, of course, but still. And then the reason is why, or the question is why, of course. Well, I think part of the answer is concern for real life in the field of politics, that balance which I told between philosophy and pragmatism, that's part of the answer. But you may perhaps relate it to even a more fundamental tendency which was dealt with in an excellent book written by a certain Regum, namely, that tendency to take the material world very seriously in imagery and so on and so on. Well, I think that's also part of the answer, or that also, in a way, shows the peculiarity of thinker like Plutarch, who was a Platonist, but still was able to give the body its due. And well, I think that's one of the reasons why I appreciate Plutarch so much. It was very nuanced thinker. So that's it. But I would like to discuss that further with you over lunch. Now I'm concerned with my body. It's not.
Yes, thank you very much. The body's the voice, and I made a good job, I think, today. And I think it is time, as was suggested very pertinently, it's the appropriate kairos for us to go to lunch. It's not a complicated task, so it's about walking distance of about 3 minutes from the faculty within the Institute de Justice et Paz, Institute of Peace and Justice, but we will go all along and all together. And we suggest you to leave your personal belongings. Not only the personal seat, only the personal belongings, you can leave them at the Institute of Business Classics that are upstairs, and they will be perfectly safe. And I also saw that meanwhile, during the morning, the sun came up, so it means that there's still hope we will have sun in Coimbra. And it was simply creating the setting for us to start with the Plutarch and then see the revelation that comes out, and of course, really the sun. So thank you very much for this very stimulating morning, and of course, now it's time to recover our strengths. Thank you.